Thank you very much, Miles. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. What a fantastic conference, what fantastic timing, what a fantastic contribution also to what I'm sure Jan and the members of the IPCC will be thinking about as they mull over this, well, amazing mandate, poison chalice, whichever way you want to look upon it. By 2018, the world is looking for answers, or at least interpretations of reality from the IPCC that I think will challenge the IPCC itself in terms of looking at how this report may simply not fit quite in the mold of past reports. If you listen, and I've had the privilege of spending the whole of today with you, to the realm in which we are discussing 1.5 degree scenarios, they essentially transcend anything that is with sufficient certainty predictable right now. And even with 60% certainty, you're basically saying that, I could be wrong 1 in 3 times. And I was struck today by, in one sense, looking for certainty in, on the one hand, acknowledging that business as usual extrapolation from the past is not going to answer the question of whether we will, by 2030, 2050, be able to speak with a sense of confidence that, yes, 1.5 degrees was something we could actually attain, and we managed to come close to it. But what is striking to me, and I think this is also where the IPCC is challenged, we have spent the past 25 to 30 years trying to begin to understand the complexity of how our planet, atmosphere, emissions, etc., interact, the biosphere, and constructing an argument centered around the imperative to act. And I would argue that the IPCC, probably already with AR4, but certainly with AR5, has taken that discourse in our society beyond the point of having to argue about the imperative. So what we're now confronted with is, first of all, this notion of time. And I think to the climate community, I would say, yes, we need clarity on how dramatically short the timelines are, but you also need to ensure that we find the right narrative to not create certainties around dates or 0.1 degrees that are simply devoid of credibility in even science that will be available to us in 3 to 4 years' time. Now, that is not to question the need for models and scenarios, but I think sometimes in the public mind, climate science has also become an element of confusion because different models, different scientists will speak sometimes on a degree of specificity that in the real world of either trying to anticipate what happens next or indeed for societies, parliaments, policymakers, CEOs, financial markets to act, simply begin to cause a certain degree of nervousness because they shift. And I think one thing that I would urge the report and the IPCC team to bear in mind is, how do we address what I think over time the IPCC did extremely well, that even in the absence of certainty, there is sufficient reason to act. Now, when you are pushing a society, a global economy, communities in all their very differential realities to the extremes of transformation, I would begin to focus the narrative less on the imperative to act, but on the opportunities to act. And obviously, throughout the day, many of you have spoken to that. That opportunity to act, I think, is the frontier that will determine on whether a 1.5 degree scenario is realistic or not. And here, let me say, I am an unapologetic advocate of challenging those who say, oh, it's too late, we've passed the point. I have not seen any evidence, and that may be my limitation, that would persuade me that there is anyone who could who can stand in this room here today, maybe could stand here in 2050, but not today, and argue with certainty that it is basically beyond our reach to think about a 1.5 world. Why do I say that? Well, so many uncertainties remain. Timelines. I mean, the heap of assumptions that are embedded in some of the timelines that are currently being used in the scenarios, they need to be much more explicitly put at the forefront of the debate rather than hidden somewhere in the footnotes, because it is actually in the assumptions that much of what will determine what happens next is hidden. But we talk about the final output of the graph. The debate today is about the assumptions that will define the opportunity pathways that in turn will determine how the world responds. Another dimension, much more in the scientific realm, feedback mechanisms, whether it is the ice-albedo effect, whether it is permafrost. These are things that we are still trying to understand what will happen, for instance, on the debate, well, maybe we'll overshoot 1.5, but then we'll come back to 1.5. Many of you in this room are far more competent at beginning to interrogate this discourse than I am. But it makes me distinctly uncomfortable to follow some of those narratives because they are sometimes so dismissive of things that at least we have not a basis on which to dismiss them as of now. The economic and political viability. Somebody just made the comment about behavioral science. I think from the political economy to historians, to anthropologists, to psychologists, and to those who specialize in scenario building, we need to focus far more on how in history have societies made these great transitions happen. Because what we are confronted with, and here I think we would all agree, we are confronted with an unprecedented challenge of transformation in human history. In a period of time that I at least cannot think of anything that even comes close to being an equivalent in just 3 to 4 decades to essentially retool an entire global economy with then probably 9 to 10 billion people. That's what decarbonization, that's what 1.5, that's what the science, and that's also what essentially I think increasingly the popular will is looking for. And again, are we really so confident that we can predict how societies will respond to that? How often in the past have people surprised themselves, governments surprised their people, economies surprised politicians in terms of what is possible? Somebody this morning, I'm sorry, I was standing just at the door there, so I couldn't see the face, made the analogy to a war economy. I think that is actually, tragic as the analogy may seem, an extremely interesting analogy to make. There are moments in our social, political history where we do things that would, under any normal assumption, be undoable. Now, I heard a lot of assumptions here today, but very few actually postulated that that war mode of operating is actually something that could happen. Why would it happen? And what would allow it to happen in order to perhaps think of a kind of transformational and disruptive set of decisions that could perfectly well still keep us on a 1.5 degree path. So that is one, I think, very important observation that I would offer. A second one is the challenge of climate change will not be addressed by climate change solutions. Now again, please forgive me, I'm not in any way trying to patronize you because you wouldn't be here if you probably didn't agree with this. The problem is that our climate change discourse is far too often still either conducted in or portrayed in terms that are almost an encapsulated universe of the climate change problem. Much of what climate change causes, much of what drives global warming or climate change greenhouse gas emissions, 25 years ago would never have been called anything that has to do with climate change. It could have been pollution, it could have been emissions, it could have been degrading of ecosystems, loss of ecosystems, diseases that move. And my point here is that I think we rapidly, for a 1.5 degree scenario, need to, as pioneers in the climate change agenda setting domain, expand, create a more systems-oriented understanding, a more synergistic-oriented research agenda and public policy debate. Because if we continue to isolate climate change as, the greatest challenge of the 21st century and create the impression that there is somehow a group of viziers who sit somewhere and will be able to fix climate change and then, we can go on with life as normal, that, I think, is probably the greatest risk to a 1.5 degree scenario. So, and Miles, forgive me if I pick up on this for a moment, because we still have a debate that we need to have on short-lived climate pollutants. There are those who think that CO2 is the single most important and almost singular litmus test by which we can look at the future in one way or another. I have, some of you may know this, during my time in UNEP, become increasingly persuaded by the opportunity to act on something called short-lived climate pollutants, black carbon, methane, tropospheric ozone, HFCs. Now, what was very striking is that for a couple of years, we spent a lot of time debating this issue, not in terms of its scientific merits, which still need debate and research, but in terms of whether one would detract from the other. Now, those are the kinds of debates that, quite frankly, we cannot afford. At this point in time, if you go back to that clock that says in 5 to 6 years we have passed the 1.5 degree point. We need all hands on deck. We also need to interrogate geoengineering approaches. We also need to be honest enough to conclude that some are simply not worth the risk, because just because something is doable, it should not be done. Just because something that is not imaginable today should not be deemed undoable tomorrow. And that is, I think, the extraordinarily difficult balancing act in which a scientific and research-oriented community has to move, that is confronted with questions that are seemingly unanswerable with confidence and certainty, and yet would allow the world to actually come to decisions that would take us, hopefully, onto a different trajectory. I believe we are truly at a point in time where, in one form or another, the world will have to think of a Manhattan type of project. I do believe that extraordinary things are possible, and that's why I say to you at the beginning of my presentation, I'm unapologetic about saying, yes, I think it is doable. Certainly not based on anything approximating business as usual, but I do believe that there are extraordinary transformational opportunities that are actually realizable. But for that, we have to envisage a world that will evolve so rapidly that probably is, from a political, economic, and even from a researcher's point of view, highly contestable right now. Now, to me, the 1.5 degree report, and let's say the report, not to put too much onus on it because it cannot carry the full weight of societal decision-making on its shoulders, the discussion about 1.5. And, let it be 1.6 if it has to be. And that's another interesting question. Or is it 1.4? But 1.5 should not become a religious, singularly defined number. It is the challenge we set ourselves in the mode of a kind of Manhattan Project to say, these are the timelines to the best of our knowledge that we have to meet. We must get an entire global community of nations, of investors, of government decision makers, of infrastructure managers, but ultimately of citizens, because it is from our citizens that we derive the license to even think of such a transformational process. It is to them that we must speak with a sense of not just pursuing a climate change agenda, but literally reinventing our economies in just 40 to 50 years in the 21st century. And in that spirit, I think this conference, and I do mean that to Miles and to Jim and to all who were involved in organizing it, I think your timing, I think the assembly of people that you have brought together here, I think also the kinds of conversations that have taken place here have been extremely important. And I hope the world out there will get a sense of both the urgency but also the adventure. We need to stop frightening people. That's my point about, the imperative argument is done. We need to start exciting people to imagine the unimaginable in terms of solutions. And 1.5 may be a very odd metaphor to use for that, but it is actually one that has to speak to not only those who live in the UK, the United States, and Japan. It's also a metaphor that has to speak to 1 billion Africans, who soon will be 2 billion Africans. I've heard very little today, except in a few remarks, about what it would mean if 2 billion Africans followed a 20th century energy system pathway. Of the current 1 billion, 700 million don't have access to modern electricity services. Just imagine for a moment, you could forget everything you have discussed here if you're not focused on what you will do for the 1.3 billion Africans who will be joining the electricity grids over the next 40 years. So that's another appeal, that we have very different realities into which very different pathways have to be initiated to converge towards a 1.5 degree world. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you at the end.
Thank you, Achim. We are running slightly over time, but Achim can take a couple of questions. Before we go to questions, though, just on Achim's last note, sitting there, suddenly it dawned on me with a sort of cold feeling in my stomach. I'd forgotten to thank, of course, Benito Müller, who has been representing that entire lobby in the world in the preparation of this conference. I hope Benito's here. Anyway, thank you, Benito. I can't... Benito, Jim and I have spent many hours in Jim's office in the preparation of this conference, and Benito did a great job of making sure that the interests of not just this corner of the world were well represented, as he has done throughout his career. So can we just take a couple of questions for Achim on that, again particularly focused on the 1.5 report and the research challenge that we have as a community in front of us. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. As I just before you, 50% reduction by the demand side. And most scenarios, including our scenario and IPCC scenario, include 50% reduction by demand and 50% by energy supply. But the developed country can do, of course, 50% reduction, but the problem is for the as you said, the developing countries. The developed countries' energy demand is increasing. The important thing is the leapfrogging. And how can we do the leapfrogging in the developing countries now a challenge? So I want to know your view about this. Thank you.
Very briefly, I think we are already seeing developing countries do it. In one session this afternoon, we were listening to a presentation from Morocco. Morocco, 5 years ago, had virtually no installed renewable energy capacity. It is now looking at, a 20 to 30% renewables electricity grid future somewhere in the next decade and a half. I may not have the exact timeline right. I've spent the last 10 years in Kenya, a country that was essentially on a classic, World Bank Global Energy Systems pathway to increasing energy capacity or electricity generating capacity. It chose out of its own interest to go down a green energy policy, put the regulatory environment in place, and today is with geothermal, with hydro, and with wind, and soon solar, probably the country with the highest percentage of renewables, certainly on the African continent, approaching 60 to 70%. I think it is perfectly doable, and I can speak with some, let's say, first-hand experience because I was very closely involved in the development of the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative in the lead up to Paris, where essentially African leaders came together and said, okay, we can make big steps forward if the international community is actually willing to stand by our side, not to pay for the whole cost, but to trigger the development of the legislative environment, because that's actually on the African continent right now the biggest constraint. There is no regulatory environment in most countries that either has feed-in tariffs or other mechanisms of this kind. And secondly, to deal with the international financial markets perception of risk. We talked a lot about risk. Africa, on average, is punished, or whatever you want to call it, by anything between 2 to 4% higher borrowing costs, and in a very generalized manner, because it's Africa. Now that erodes the cost advantage or the cost competitiveness of precisely what renewable energy could do today. And if it hadn't been for China, ironically, that made the renewable energy technology suddenly economically, never mind financially, accessible, Africa would probably still be thinking about renewables as something that belongs to others. Now something very different is happening. And here, my last point, the international community has by default become probably the single biggest constraint to Africa actually embarking on it. The intent of the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative was to get rid of the, KfW, USAID, GIZ, JICA, and all the other agencies doing, in a sense, these pilot projects, arguing that with a 10 or 20 megawatt pilot project, you could change an entire national energy system. To putting a major fund in place in Africa, led by the African Development Bank, allowing African countries to invest rapidly over the next 4 years in doubling their renewable energy infrastructure. Now, remarkably in Paris, not 5 billion, but actually 10 billion, because 5 billion was the target. 10 billion public finance was pledged, based on which about 20 to 25 billion private finance would be leveraged. The sad thing is, 6 months after Paris, the old donor mechanisms have been chosen over actually creating a powerful locomotive centered in Africa. So we still have some work to do. But I think developing countries are by no means on an inevitable path of having to increase the carbon footprint, because Kenya is doubling its electricity generating infrastructure and actually reducing its carbon footprint. So, and this is not a singular story. We can see it happening in many countries now.
Yeah, I just wondered if you could briefly comment on international institutions, because we aren't going to get there without increasing their capacity. And apart from Paris, they aren't working as well as they ought to be. So.
Well, that could be a conference in itself, isn't it? And having just led an institution, there are always two dimensions that I feel are very important when we talk about something like the United Nations, the World Bank, the multilateral development banks. One is, the reason they exist is that we have differences. So people who always complain about, things take long and there's a lot of talk in the UN, that's why we have a United Nations, because we have differences and we need to sit around the table, because if you don't have the table to negotiate, the only other option is to ignore one another or go into conflict with one another. So that part of the international institutions, we just have to live with. It's the world we live in. What is totally unnecessary and what is in urgent need of reform is the business processes, it's the inertia, it's also the being beholden to a paradigm of development and international cooperation that is simply redundant. It's outdated, it's outmoded, and it is just not giving way because it's a model on which institutions have grown over 50 years. That applies in the UN, it applies to the multilateral development banks, it applies to bilateral agencies. And I think the key issue here will be give more resources to those who actually are at the front line of decision making. And that is why I mentioned the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. Let Africans determine where they actually want to invest the funds, but make a contract with them that, it is for certain deliverables in return. And stop trying to emulate a national decision-making process by 3 bureaucrats sitting in an office in Washington, Berlin, London, or somewhere else. Because this is the reality of much of project finance, unfortunately still in the aid system. So that is at least one slice of the international institutions that I think merit both recognition for what they do. And I've often in my years in the UN argued, where would we be if it hadn't been for the scientists who found refuge in the UNEP offices in Nairobi and WMO 28 years ago, when nobody was talking about CO2 emissions? Where would we be if it hadn't been for Rio and the UNFCCC forcing nations de facto every year to confront their own unwillingness to confront science and then speak to their public about what they were doing? Where would we be without a Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and others, many, many others, who literally over a decade or longer, time and again brought the world's attention to this global imperative to act? Because I think, again, without a collective, and that we now have at the Paris Agreement, a collective climate response, all of our work would be highly questionable in terms of its relevance. And I think that is a breakthrough that we should also associate with an otherwise, yes, sometimes very troubled system.
Having given the last question to one of the young scientists, let me give you the last message.
Okay, Derek Osborne. I wanted to make a comment really and invite your view on it. I feel the change from Kyoto, Copenhagen to Paris as being a change from, oh dear, this is all very difficult, how can we share the burdens of frightfully difficult change, to a measure of hope coming out of an excitement of Paris and opportunity. And that, of course, it's a very major challenge, and we've been hearing these 2 days the extent and the speed of the change that could be made. But I think we've also felt the animation and the energy that's beginning to flow into it in all sorts of different places. And we've also got I think I'm hearing the economists right, that there are going to be real benefits from the world. There's going to be a great balance very positive net balance of benefit over disbenefit when we have got the world cleaned up to carbon neutrality. And what 1.5 is telling us is let's get that benefit bigger and quicker and we shall be even better off. So this is a moment of we can do it. And I do hope that the IPCC, in one of the ways it will be differing in its 2018 report from its earlier ones, is to give some sense of the excitement of that challenge, and that what we've got to get behind is all the people who are trying to move things faster and more vigorously forward, rather than putting too many cautious things about how difficult it all is and how on earth are we ever going to share out the burdens. Let's get away from the burdens talk.
Thank you, Derek. I think on that, I think I echoed what you were saying earlier. Okay, can we all just finally thank Achim for a great closing, and thank you all for a great conference.